شباب برا ما كاش الخمسة يا ماما يا ماما
Tens of thousands of Algerians have been taking part in nationwide protests since February. They're opposed to 82-year-old President Abdelaziz Bouteflika's decision to run for a fifth term. He's been ruling the country for 20 years, and for the past 6, he's struggled to speak or walk. So what do these protests mean for the country's future? Algeria gained independence from France in 1962. The push for self-rule was led by the so-called Army of National Liberation, which later became the country's formal military force. It has played a major part in Algeria's political system for more than 5 decades. Young Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who had joined the Army of National Liberation during the revolution, quickly became involved in political life as well. He became the Minister of Foreign Affairs at the age of 26. Corruption charges eventually forced him into self-imposed exile in 1981, first to Switzerland and then the United Arab Emirates. Bouteflika returned to Algeria in 1987 and was readmitted into the country's ruling party. The following year, a protest movement, led mostly by young people and fueled by a major recession, swept across the country. It was met with a government crackdown. 120 people died, according to official figures, but activists put the number around 500. The demonstrations managed to force the government to end the single-party system and grant wider media freedom. It also led to the country's first democratic elections. The gradual political liberalization that followed allowed the Islamic Salvation Front Party to gain a foothold in domestic politics. In response, the military cancelled the country's legislative vote in 1991, which historians say would have certainly brought the Islamic Salvation Front to power. What followed was a 10-year civil war, which left as many as 200,000 Algerians dead, according to human rights groups. In 1999, in the midst of the war, Bouteflika agreed to run for president. His opponents complained the vote was rigged and dropped out. Bouteflika won with 74% of the vote. He spent his first year as president trying to end the civil war. He pushed forward with the 2005 Charter for Peace and National Reconciliation, which granted amnesty to armed groups. He then set out to get the country out of diplomatic isolation and kickstart its stagnant economy. In 2008, the president changed the constitution to allow him to run for a third term. The Arab uprisings of 2011 toppled regional leaders, including those of neighboring Tunisia and Libya. But Bouteflika was able to use Algeria's vast oil wealth and the threat of instability to remain in power.
In 2011, when there were region-wide protests, Algerians protested as well. However, Bouteflika and the regime gave certain promises to stop the protest, and these promises included some political reforms and some economic reforms as well. Most of those economic reforms were not kept, and the political reforms were only partially kept, and things kept accumulating.
But by 2012, it appeared Bouteflika was ready to step down.
أشرت إليكم من قبل وأكرر اليوم بأن جيلي طاب جنان جيلي طاب جنان طاب جنان طاب جنان.
But it wasn't. A year later, he suffered a debilitating stroke, which confined him to a wheelchair. But Bouteflika stood for elections again in 2014 and won his fourth term. Public sentiment began shifting, in large part due to a global drop in oil prices. It forced his government to cut state subsidies. Youth unemployment is now estimated at about 29%, an alarming statistic in a country where 70% of the population is believed to be under the age of 30.
Young protesters have also said that they will get rid of the regime because it's a highly corrupted one. And there's a joke in Algeria which says that the only thing that has been democratized in Algeria is corruption. If some have been able to cope with it somehow, the majority of them feel that it's not a way forward for the country.
Ruling party executives had been signaling that Bouteflika would once again be their candidate for the April 18 election. But it wasn't until he officially announced his candidacy on February 10th that people decided they had had enough. Protests spread across different cities and have been growing ever since. Journalists, students, lawyers, and politicians have all joined in. Even 83-year-old Jamila Bouhairid, an iconic figure of the independence war against France, was seen among the protesters.
People are fed up. They did not wake up suddenly one morning and thought that it was time to oppose the regime, but it was a long series of repression and marginalization from the official political life.
Protesters are calling for a complete overhaul of the political system.
Algerian political system is not just based on Bouteflika himself. It is an eclectic system. There is the involvement of the military, of the president Bouteflika, of the party, and also business elites as well. So in this eclectic system, probably the most powerful part is the military.
Since his stroke in 2013, Bouteflika has rarely appeared in public. He's been in Switzerland since February 24th for what the government calls routine medical checks. Despite the protests, Bouteflika formalized his candidacy on March 4th. But he announced that if elected, he'll help set a date for new polls in which he will not run. That has done nothing to stop the protests. The military insists it will not allow the country to fall back into violence and will ensure stable and smooth conditions for the election. But it's still unclear how it plans to do that.
For now, what they are doing is that they are opening the scene for free discussions. They are trying to reconciliate. So this is really a moment of reconciliation and of celebration for Algerians. Once they will achieve this goal of reconciliation, then, in my opinion, they will have to think about much more localized actions that will prevent former people from the FLN and even prevent the elections to take place.
For now, protesters continue to flood the streets of Algeria, pushing for change and hoping their efforts will bring their country together.